Good evening, everybody. So nice to see you here. Welcome, Jeet, to Calcutta.
Thank you, Ruchir. Pleasure to be here. I
Uh,
always knew we would end up in jail one day.
we would, exactly. We two troublemakers go back a long way. 1997, to be precise, I think. June 97.
That's right.
So that's a way back. Yeah, we both had, well, Jeet had hair, I had black hair. So it's like that. Lone Man, congratulations. Fantastic book. I took my time to get around to reading it because I was dealing with my own book and various things. I read slowly. But this is one of the most fantastic books to have come out of any literature anywhere, Indian literature in English. Please grab it and read it. That's the first thing I have to say. Strange creature, Mr. Thayil. You know, the book is called The Elsewhereans. It is very hard for me to give you an Instagrammable one-line strapline for it because it's very hard to define. It's a novel. It's a very personal family memoir. It's docufiction. It's essay writing at its best. And all these things meld into each other, wrong-foot you, surprise you.
It's also a ghost story,
It's also a ghost story.
a travelogue, and partly a detective story.
All of that too. So, Jeet, you didn't plan this before you started writing it, did you?
No, I knew it. I knew the subject, but I didn't know the form until
So what's the subject, according to you?
it is the story of a family,
Right.
a migrant family that becomes that migrates basically all over the world, and then returns where they started to find out that they are no longer part. They're no longer local. So that's the
You're
story.
no
But
longer off that place.
no, as
Yeah.
you know, none of us are.
Yeah, it's very true. That whole Eliot thing of you know a place better once you, what's the line? The TSL.
When you return to where you started.
Yeah, and you rediscover the place as if for the first time, but also like a stranger. So, was this brewing in the back of your head behind the other novels in terms of process?
It's been in the works for a long, long time. I had a lot of material. I had my father's journalistic journals from his time in Vietnam and in Hong Kong. He had kept quite detailed notes and notebooks, and I used to look at those notes quite often, and the photographs that he had kept from those days. And also, I'd noticed that in the notebooks, some of the details, and they were notes that a novelist would take, not notes that a journalist would take. For example, there would be the color of somebody's jacket, the way somebody's hair looked in the light. There would these little details that jumped out at me as a novelist because I thought this is exactly the kind of notes that a novelist would make if they were in some place, in a place like Vietnam, and knew that eventually they would want to write about Vietnam. And then I also noticed that in the notebooks, many of the notes, and they were divided by these horizontal lines, many of them had ticks, and many of them did not. In fact, there were more unticked than ticked. And so I asked him what the ticks meant. And what the ticks meant was that he had used those bits in the journalism that he produced later. And I was struck by the fact that some of the juiciest, most colorful bits of perception in those notes had no tick against them. And I wanted to use them. And in fact, I quote from those notes at some length in the
Yeah,
book.
you do. Yeah. And also, photographs come out of this, other artifacts. Was he okay with you using this stuff? Was he fine?
He was actually, he liked the idea a lot. And he liked it more than my mother did. My mother did not like the idea. I had to ask permission from both of them because they are characters in this story. And their pictures appear in the story. They appear under their own names. So, there's an ethical question. If you're going to use real living people in a novel, you have to ask permission. So I did ask permission. My father loved the idea. For example, the cover photograph is a Vietnamese woman who was the manager of some of my father and his travels in Vietnam. And there's a hint that they have a romantic liaison. So my father loved this idea. My mother did not at all.
Do you think they did or didn't they?
I'm not going to say.
Okay,
Read the
sure.
book.
No, of course, I've read the book. But no, I'm just going to just come to you very quickly as a reader, but also as a reader who's a writer occasionally. I find it very difficult to write about my mother. I've written about my father. And yet, my first novel does have my parents as characters very differently from yours. But I couldn't have written that novel if they'd been alive. Because I know that my dad probably would have loved the idea, my mother not, again.
I
But
think
you
mothers,
did it while
mothers
your
are wiser, and certainly my
more
mother was
protective, right? Perhaps.
certainly my mother was wiser. She knew immediately that if there was going to be a novel about them, she knew, knowing me and knowing my previous novels, she knew this was nothing to celebrate, that this would be something to be concerned about. My father, on the other hand, did not. And I think it's just women are wiser, as we
They
all
are.
know.
But your relationship with your father was not. You keep bringing it up, and it seems to me you were not close, or you didn't have long father and son conversations.
And certainly not when I was younger, but towards the end of his life, yes, very much.
So
he
when you become a
changed.
writer, how does he take it? Because he's clearly a person who wanted to be a writer, as you say, and like Naipaul's dad, but you're a far better writer than Naipaul, if I may say so.
Oh, please.
No, I insist. No, sorry.
That's so not true, but
Yeah,
anyway.
a different writer. Okay, let's go. But again, a father who wanted to be a writer, but again, a very different father, because your father actually has a very successful, great career in journalism, groundbreaking stuff. But somehow, as you describe so vividly, it gets in the way of fiction, the journalism. When he's writing time-bound and there's no deadline, and he's got all the freedom in the world. What do you do with that? How did he take you becoming a writer when it was clear that you were first a poet and then?
He came from a generation of Indian journalists who would do anything to not begin a sentence with the first person, with the word I. So they would write journalism in which the first person would never appear. And it was a kind of a religious journalistic tenet of that entire generation of writers. And I'm talking about journalists during independence time, because that was when my father became a journalist. Never use the first person. And so the point is, when you keep yourself out of a narrative, which changed over the intervening decades. Now, of course, journalists put themselves into the narrative, even if they shouldn't. When you do that, when you take yourself out of the narrative, it changes the kind of journalism you do. So I think when later, he had always wanted to write fiction. But the journalistic training that he imbibed as a young sub-editor and then as an editor, and then he did that for decades, I think it prevented him from being able to have an authentic first person.
Or even without the first person, a voice where, sometimes you can write a novel with the writer isn't present as a first person voice, right? If it's omnipresent third person, but he couldn't bring himself to do the fiction bit for some reason, I think.
He tried and he couldn't. And also, when I first started writing as a poet, one of the things he told me very early on was not to write poetry, And
why?
Well, he said, "There's no money in it. You're never going to get anywhere." And of course, that's the worst thing you can tell a young poet. If you tell a young poet not to write poetry because there's no money in it, they will absolutely stick with poetry till the end of their lives.
Dreams of poems will come out.
Of course. And for that, actually, I'm very grateful to him for telling me not to write poetry, because I've been doing it now for, 50 years. So You know, I owed that much to him. Also, it was the kind of thing that you would not expect from a literary-minded gentleman. You know, you would expect this from a businessman. Don't write poetry, son. There's no money in it. You don't expect it from a writer and reader, from a man who had James Joyce and Dylan Thomas in his library, who was so serious about fiction that he bought first editions of the great novels all over the world. My first reading was from my father's library. And that's another thing I'm very, very grateful to him for. He had kind of impeccable taste in literature. He had Henry Miller, he had E.M. Forster, he had several of the poets. He had Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes. He had Eliot, obviously, that entire generation of Indians did. But he had genuine taste in literature, except when it came to his son, and which is a very Indian father kind of.
Do you think
thing.
it was like he felt like he's never going to be as good as Dylan Thomas or T.S. Eliot? Or is it like, look at the sad lives a lot of these people led, and I don't want you to suffer like that? What is it?
I think it was also that he was a man with 2 children, a wife. He had to support the family. So there was no question of him being able to write a novel, you know, unless he were to do it in the small hours of the morning. He had to do a job because he had a family to support. And so that is, I think, the crucial factor in what he became and what he did. Again, something that I'm grateful for.
What about your mother when you become a writer? Because I remember my mom being quite happy with various things that I did, but when I turned to filmmaking, she was like, it wasn't part of her, what she understood to be her universe. And my dad was a writer, but he was also paying the bills by running a business, but he was a well-known Gujarati writer, so he wasn't going to say to me, don't be a filmmaker, don't be an artist. He was very supportive. But my mother, who loved literature and who loved art, didn't want me to be, if I'd been an architect or even a writer, she'd have been okay with it. But the filmmaking thing freaked her out. What freaked out your mother? Was she okay with you being a poet? And because you were a poet first.
Yeah.
For the longest time, till Narcopolis comes out, you're known as a poet.
She, in fact, preferred the poetry. She was appalled by Narcopolis, you know, because it was about drugs. And in fact, many years later, when a journalist approached her for a story, and you know, had already spoken to me, and I'd spoken quite frankly about those years. And then the journalist spoke to my mother and asked her, "So, what did you feel in those years when your son was taking drugs?" And she told the journalist, absolutely straight-faced, he never did drugs, you know. And the journalist told me later, as a mother, she said, I appreciated what your mother said.
Yeah.
As a mother, I appreciated how your mother lied, you know.
So the other thing which I love about the book is it's a travelogue, as you said. I mean, every chapter section has got a place name and dates, and it takes you through, and that's kind of like a deceptive handrail across the book. It's a rhythmical handrail. So you get something like Chicken Kiev, Hanoi, Hong Kong, Bangalore. Then in another chapter you'll get later, you'll get Paris, and then you'll get Berlin and Elmau. Paris, Cochin, Paris. This kind of rhythmic stuff. And so when you're in the middle of writing this, you're also pulling out old experiences, old material, which fits and seems to make sense with this, right? So what's that process like?
This book was originally twice its size. So it was a much bigger book, and I ended up deleting about 50,000 words and made it half the size it was, and I think made it a much better book, tighter book, no kind of wasted, self-indulgent paragraphs. But to do that, it took me 4 years.
Right.
So, you know, because this is a kind of unusual form, it mixes fact and fiction and memoir and a travelogue and a ghost story and all the other things that Ruchir mentioned. it took me a while to figure out how to do it because I'd never done something like this before. And once that was locked into place, it was very easy to finish, to
Right.
write.
Yeah. What about the other material? Do you think that's just put aside? You might be able to use some of it later, right?
For sure. Nothing's ever wasted.
Wasted.
You know,
Exactly.
if it's any good, you will end up using it at some point, in some way.
Do you want to read something from the book for us?
I'm going to begin. Each chapter begins with a short passage, a kind of introduction to that chapter. And I'll read the first one. And I'll also read one of the epigrams. The first epigram is by Czesław Miłosz, the poet. It says, "When a writer is born into a family, the family is finished." I think that's something my mother would absolutely agree with. And before the book begins, there's a note that says, "The real names and photographs in these pages are fictions. The fictional names and events are documentary. The truth, as we know, lies in between." And the passage that begins the first chapter is, "If memory could speak, what would it say? Only lies. Beautiful lies, quietly said, with a straight face and a pure heart. And in the saying, the lies of every color and size and degree of intent, all the lies would be true. As here, at the start, where memory might say something as plain and clear as this: all stories begin with a river and end with one. And you might say in reply, yes, I believe this to be true."
So, I mean, I normally don't do this, but with your book, I was obliged to sit down and actually make notes. I mean, one of the best scenes that I've got, which is, you know, very different from the rest of the book, is the wedding feast, where your parents, or people who may not be your parents, but the fictional parents, get married. And it's a Malayali wedding feast with rum and food and banana leaf and weird relatives, which is amazing. There's a line somewhere around there which says, "A gift Thomas nurtures and bestows to vanish when emotion threatens." I think that's brilliant. So I do see, actually, in the book, a real pulsation between quite strong emotion, quite melodramatic stuff, quite out in your face things, and then everything's kind of held back, pulled back, and you get long passages of just very minimalistic, almost Drupad-like detail, where, you know, you're just caught up with the beauty of the writing and what's being spoken about, which is his family actually traversing these post-independence years. They start in Mahim and in Bombay, and later arrive back to Bombay with a 6-inch view of the sea, which is lovely, in Bandra. But in between that, you go to Bihar, you go to Hong Kong, you're in New York, which is where I guess you get your American accent from, I've always wondered. And then you come back, and then at some point, you realize that the writer is peeled away from the parents, and he's tracking the parents, but there's the writer's own life as a young man. Quite mad adventures start fitting in with the larger story. So when you're mapping the different travels around the different rivers and seas and whatnot, was there any kind of conscious effort to try and fit things in, or did you let inspiration come and say, okay, I've written this, now what would come next? How does, process-wise, how does that work?
In fact, there's so much that I didn't use, including some very interesting photographs that just didn't fit this story. And I didn't want it to be photograph heavy, you know. It needed to be text, and every once in a while an image, a visual would lift the text up in a way. That's what I wanted. But there's so much good material that I think one way of doing it would be to do a second documentary novel, in which...
But a more photo-heavy one, perhaps? Or
Well, just with a different subject, really. But I haven't figured that out yet. There's just a lot of material left, and I would like to use some of it. You know, there's a large part of the story, especially the part in New York, is only touched on in this book.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So that brings me to the obvious question, which you must have been asked several times. Why the photographs, and when did you make the decision to include them? Because they're not included in the way, say, W.G. Sebald includes photographs. They're not included in the way, say, someone like, you know, various different people. Let's not, I mean, basically, John Berger, for example, would use photographs very differently in his books. These are pictures which, I mean, what is your thinking behind the pictures, and why did you choose the ones you did?
Some of the pictures are purely documentary. For example, the photo of my father coming out of jail. Hazaribagh Central Jail in Bihar. He was inside for about a month because as the editor of a newspaper there called Searchlight, he took the side of the students who were rioting, and because of that, he carried their views in the paper, carried editorials kind of defending them, and because of that, he was put in prison by the chief minister, whose name was K.B. Sahai.
Right.
So
this is the 50s.
this is the
Early
the
60s. 60s. Right.
mid-60s.
Right.
So there was photos of that. There were letters that he wrote, which I knew had to appear in this book. So now those are purely documentary, that material.
Yeah.
But there was also other material that worked in a Sebaldian sense, absolutely fictional. There are photos in here that are fictional. Of course, I'm not going to say which ones they are.
Right.
But they are entirely fictional. They're found photos that I have invented a
story around.
And weaved it in so well, even if I say so myself, that no reader is going to be able to tell which ones are fake and which ones are real. And I'm certainly not going to tell you.
Okay.
Not even at pain of death.
I don't know how many people have, I mean, we can go on. There's a lot more to talk about and discuss. I mean, I've got a whole bunch of lines and ideas here, but I think maybe in case people in the audience have read the book or have questions, we have about 10 minutes I mean, I'll come back with some interjections later, of course, but does anyone have any questions? Okay. While you think about that, let me ask you another one. Again, personal anecdote, but Jeet, when I was finishing my book, or at least you called me up at some point and said, dude, where's your book? And I said, well, I'm...
Not at one point, at several points.
Several points, but there's one particular moment I remember, just around COVID or just after or during, I can't remember. And I told you that book had reached a certain mad length of 280,000 words or something. And he said, no, cut it in half, chuck it. No one wants to read fat books. Everyone wants to read slim books. People just don't read anymore, etc. But I produced this fat volume. But what I have to say is that, in a sense, if my book is also something that's against the Instagram age and against uh, the trend of the times, your book is as much, if not more, against the trend of the times, because this is a slimmer volume, but that's not the point. In it, distilled is a kind of reading and writing philosophy, which is asking you, you've got references to Baudelaire and to various other writers and various things going on. You've got historical reference points. I mean, people keep talking about a compelling story, a compelling story. My agent kept saying, what's your book about? What's the story? And I'm like, try working that out with Jeet. I mean, the book keeps you gripped, keeps drawing you in, seduces you, keep reading it. But if someone was to ask you what the story is, it's not a plot-driven detective novel, yes, ghost novel, yes, travelogue, yes. But it is it's a book against these times, I would argue.
Thank you very much. That's a compliment. I'm
No, it's meant as one.
very happy to hear that. You know, this
I mean,
idea
it's challenging for the reader, especially, I guess, younger readers, to try and grapple with this thing, because it's not got a straight plot line, and it's not got, character development and, laying out
and
the
a neat
neat kind
arc of plot.
arc
Yeah.
of plot and denouement.
denouement. Yeah.
So, sorry, go on.
Yeah, I think we've got to the stage of reading in the world when one thing that I thought would never change, and that is a sentence. For me, the great books are the books that you go back to and examine at the cellular level of the sentence. And you find a sentence that you want to read again and again and figure out how that writer got that effect that leaves something you can't articulate in your brain and your body, but it's a very real effect. And you want to work out how it was done. And I've noticed that isn't really something that writers try for anymore. And what Ruchir was talking about is the elevator pitch, what his agent was talking about.
Yeah, this is the one-line thing.
How do you describe your book in one sentence? So if you're in the elevator with a publisher, how do you describe your book in one line so that the publisher will be interested in publishing it? And what a reductionist, sad way of articulating what a book is about. If you can put it in one sentence, I think
maybe don't write it.
Maybe don't write it. Why bother? The first time I was asked this question, by the way, was by your favorite novelist and nonfiction writer, Naipaul. He asked, what is the novel about? And I'd never been asked this question. I was much younger. And I said something.
Which novel was he asking
This is
about?
Narcopolis.
Was he alive when Narcopolis came out?
Yeah, he was.
Oh, right.
And he said, so what is it about? It hadn't come out yet. It was coming out in a few months. He said, what is it about? And I said, it's about some people who travel from India to... And as the words were leaving my mouth, I realized I just made an
I mean, he's standing at the net ready to chop you down, isn't he? Kind of thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. See, yeah, no, you can keep Naipaul. Thank you. No, I mean, there are other people whose names I will not mention, people who are lauded as people fall over themselves to get their latest book, and they're like the most horrible workmanlike prose, and how that gets past the editors and their own family members. I have no idea. But we admire them sometimes, and I find that...
And novels will survive because whatever might happen to the actual nitty-gritty of the sentence, the cellular structure of a book, stories will survive because we need stories as humans. We need narratives. We need fiction, we need poetry, we need stories to make sense of our lives.
Sure, but would the great sentences survive?
Maybe.
Without the armature of a story?
I mean, from our lips to God's ears.
Yes, of course, absolutely. Okay, I think we've got 5 more minutes. Anybody? Any questions? Srivats, yes, go ahead.
You can take this.
Second question there.
Well, I can just ask the question.
Just come forward and ask. Oh, there's a microphone. Yeah.
So you call the book a travelogue. Ruchir described places: Hanoi, Paris, New York. In a book that is ostensibly being about somewhere, why did you choose to call it Elsewhereans?
In
I
fact,
told him to.
I owe that title to my editor on the book, Rahul Soni. I had 6 different titles, working titles for the novel, but the word "the Elsewhereans" turns up in the book. It's a phrase I coined, a word I coined for the people in this book, and he said that should be the title of this book. And I resisted it right until the end. I had other titles, Stormy Monday, The Migrants, 6 other titles. I'm so glad at the end, good sense prevailed, and I went with the Elsewhereans.
There was a poll taken. I was also asked at one point by you and Rahul.
Yeah, that's true.
And I kind of
Yeah.
screamed that you have to have it as the
Yeah, you did. You did.
Yep. So I'll take some credit for that small
the,
one.
the thing is, it's called the Elsewhereans because it's about somewhere, but it's also about nowhere. And I think today, wherever you might be from, even if you've been living in the same small town your entire life, things have changed so quickly around you that it no longer feels like your home or your old place. It feels like somewhere else. And in that sense, who isn't an Elsewherean?
Elsewherean, absolutely. Your question, please.
Hi. So my question is also related to the elsewhereness of life. And my understanding is that both of you as authors have also had lives which have taken you everywhere. How easy or difficult is it to express that through your writing and to make sense of the elsewhereness of your own life as you write about it?
No, you answer first because.
In fact, the thing about writing, especially prose as opposed to poetry, is you write fiction or nonfiction about, say, a place you've visited, and it's only then that you understand it, that you figure it out, because until you write it, it just passes through you. You might have been wherever, to Sri Lanka, and you might have been there for a month, and then you come back, and if you don't put it down, it passes through you, you retain nothing. When you write about it, you have to think about it. You think about the place, about your place in that place, and the writing makes sense of the experience. I think that's just something that only prose does. Poetry doesn't do that. Poetry, in fact, nurtures the chaos. Prose orders it and makes it manageable, and that's, I think, one of the great beauties of writing fiction.
So Jeet and I have had very different lives. Jeet has avoided having children, which is a smart move. And he's moved around the world. He's followed his heart. He's followed his whims. He's followed his keyboard wherever and led the life that he has led. I led a very different life where for about 30 years of my life, from 1990 to 2020 almost, I was oscillating between 2 children in London who would occasionally come back to India because their mother was of Indian origin, but we'd split up. And I would be going to London to look after the kids. And then I'd come back to India and be without the kids. I mention this because when you start connecting a place and prose, all the stuff I've written, I mean, forget my columns for the newspapers where I have written about London and Paris and Berlin. But having lived for half the time in London, I consider myself a North Londoner as much as a South Calcuttan. I've not had a single short story. I've had ideas, but I've not written a single short story or a chapter in a novel about London. In both my novels, you'll get Paris. In the first novel, you'll get New York and Paris and Delhi and Bombay. You don't get London. And I wondered about that myself when I was reading your book, that you are processing and writing about stuff, but clearly when you were there experiencing it, that was feeding into your notes or whatever your memory, however you store your memories. And for me, it's just been this weird gap. Maybe that stuff will start coming out now. But again, you can't time it when you write about something in your life. And when your mind wants to suddenly make sense of something. So that's, I mean, my only rule for my next novel is, talk about being Elsewherean, is that it's not going to have anything to do with Calcutta, and it's not going to be historical. So
And there's going to be no hotels in it.
there might be hotels. No, I can't promise that. What's a novel without a hotel?
I know. Who'd want to live there?
Okay, we are out of time, but any last question, anyone? Someone's thought of something? Quick. No? Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Jeet. Congratulations.
Thanks so much,
Amazing
Ruchir.
book.
Thank you. Real pleasure. Thanks for coming, everyone.